Welcome everyone to this webinar and what's new for Reload for Retain, Backup and Disaster Recovery for Retain. So today we're going to be talking about Reload for Retain 2.0 and talk about some of those new features. My name is Q Mangus. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Guava, and we're joined by Tay Kratzer, who's the developer of Reload for Retain, and he's going to be doing the presentation today. A few things before we get started that I wanted to take note of is this webinar is being recorded. So everyone on this call will receive an email with a link to the recording, so if you want to review that. Also, you can view this recording and others at youtube.com/guavatv. That's our repository for all of our webinars and other videos. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to put those through in the question window or the chat window, and we will get to those questions as we go along. So I'd encourage you to do that, and if you have questions, and we will move on to Reload for Retain. Tay, go ahead, and it's your time.
Well, thank you, Q. Okay, so we're going to first start out with a slideshow, and I'm just going to do some stuff over on my end. There we go. That way I can see what's going on. We're going to talk about Reload for Retain 2.0, latest version of Reload for Retain, and tell you about some great features about this solution. So let me just start out with, why, we created Reload for Retain. There was a particular customer who said, hey, I'm trying to back up Retain. The internal requirements that we have at United Bank, this particular customer, are that we get a backup of all of our systems, all of our major systems every 24 hours. And they were finding that their Reload for Retain backups were taking 40 hours. And so this was really problematic for them. And so what we did was they contacted me. They actually conceptualized on the idea of how to back up Retain in a very efficient manner versus other backup solutions. And the net result is they're getting backups every day now in less than an hour, about half an hour typically for a typical day. And so they've got tremendous success with this product, and so we went ahead and designed this for everyone to be able to implement this software if they so choose. And so let's talk about this, what Reload for Retain does for you. It gives you push-button disaster recovery, and just we will demonstrate that today. And some other really powerful features is this idea of server mirroring. So you don't have to set this up, but if you'd like, it's a really cool feature. It's the notion of, instead of getting a backup just once a day, you can get a continuous backup. Now, for customers that are just using Retain to dredge out email, from their email platform, then mirroring might be overkill, might not be a requirement, because if you know that your dredging period, let's say, always finishes by 3 a.m. every day, then if you did your backup, say, at 4 a.m. And the backup takes half an hour, we'll say, then your backup is just as well that you run it once a day versus this notion of mirroring, which is a continuous backup. Now, the value of a continuous backup becomes really, really nice in systems in which the dredging period goes over a longer window of time. So, for example, this particular bank, even though the backups only take half an hour, okay, their dredging period goes on for, I believe, 5 hours in the day. So this idea of having a continuous backup was very, very attractive to them, because now instead of their backup being potentially 24 hours old, it's really approximately about 5 minutes old, because of the ability to mirror the data vis-a-vis the solution. Another great feature is the auto import of retained databases in MySQL systems. And so let me explain that. So let's say you've got MySQL as the database that you use. Now, certainly if you've got MS SQL or Oracle, Reload is still going to be a very successful product for you. In fact, United Bank, they're using Microsoft SQL. And they have a very good backup solution in place for their SQL server and databases and so forth. So it's not like they needed Reload for Retain for backing up their database. They needed it simply for backing up their archives and their indexes. But anyways, back to a customer that's on MySQL, what Slick is Reload for Retain will back up your MySQL database. It's a dump, pretty much. And then when it gets over to the Reload server, okay, it can then automatically import that into whatever database you choose over on the Reload server if you implement a database there. So what's really slick about that is in a disaster recovery scenario, instead of sitting there and going, hey, yeah, I know I've got a good backup of this data. Oh, gee, now I need to import this database, and it's going to take however long it's going to take. Your downtime can be just nil because it's been automatically imported in. Now, for a larger customer with MySQL, like just yesterday I was working with a customer that had several thousand users. Their import of their MySQL database took 80 hours. So for that particular customer, we're going to look at, for them, putting in what's called a master slave of their MySQL database, and that's probably going to be a more feasible approach than an 80-hour import time on a MySQL dump. Okay, so. And then the other great thing about Reload for Retain is the ability to actually use your backup server for retained tasks. And again, we'll demonstrate that for you. So in other words, instead of it just being like, something over on the side that, maybe someday you use, you could actually consider, and under certain circumstances, using your Reload, the data on your Retain system that's hosted on your Reload server. So let's just talk about, let's get off of Reload for Retain for a moment and just talk about, how you're backing up your Retain server. Now, I've actually talked to a lot of customers who don't have a backup of their Retain system, and I've even had some people say, hey, well, Retain is my backup, and that's a fair point. I can see what they're saying, and in a lot of ways you could consider Retain as a backup of your system. But then what I'll do is I'll pose a question to them. I'll say, well, so okay, that's good. Now, what if you were to lose your Retain server? Okay, and pause for a moment, and then like, oh, that'd be really bad. Yeah, and so then we talk about Reload for Retain, or they'll say, hey, I've got VMware, so it's backed up with that. Okay, well, or it's on a SAN which is backed up. Okay, well, so let's ask a question then. Can you challenge your backup? And so let me tell you what I mean by, oh, gee, I thought that was on the next slide. Gee. Okay, I had a slide that talked about challenging your backup. So I'll just give you the idea. The idea is of challenging your backup is, can you go in and can you log into this backup in a sense, okay? So fire up Retain, log into it. So if you're logging in, that challenges the database, so then the database connection's working, and that's all in place. That's great. And then can you search for items? And if you can search for items, then and find them, okay, then you know that the indexing component's working. And then when you find those items or you browse for items, when you click on them, can you actually see the items? Can you see the content instead of just the metadata? In other words, you go in, you click on an item, you see a message body, for example. Can you see that message body? If you can, then you know that your blobs are being backed up. And so that's what a solution such as Reload for Retain gives you, is the ability to challenge your backup. It's not cold data that you're throwing in the corner of some backup solution, and you're hoping that you're going to be able to knit something together if in fact there's a disaster. So you're moving from theoretical to realistic. And that's a lot more comfortable position to be in versus when you're in a disaster and you don't really have proof that this backup solution that you've got is working correctly. That's how I even got into the backup business years ago. About a dozen years ago, I was making backup solutions for what's called GroupWise for Novell, and I got into it because the customer that we had a disaster recovery, no, sorry, we had a restore event that we needed to do. They didn't have a disaster, but we had a restore event, and it took us 3.5 days to get the data restored and usable. But more particularly, what was concerning was they weren't really getting a good backup of just a few of the components. So we got about 80% of the data back using their backup solution, but it took forever. Because they didn't have a way to challenge their backups, they really didn't know that they had this flank that wasn't covered, that wasn't taken care of. So okay, so let's come back to Retain for a minute and just talk about the Retain architecture. And in Retain, you've got really four components here. I've got 3 listed here, but you've got your software, okay, and your software configuration files, and then you have your database, which is really just metadata about the data inside of your Retain system. You have your archive files, your blob files, we call that. That's the content, so or the attachments inside of messages that are archived into Retain. And then you have indexes that allows you to search your data. Without indexes, you can browse, but you certainly need to be able to search your data to make this Retain an efficient solution. So let's talk about backing up each of these components, okay? Your database must be backed up. If you lose your database, nothing can be recovered. Now, the good thing is there's very mature, excellent solutions for both Oracle and MS SQL. I'm very grateful for a particular DBA last week who helped us to restore a Retain database on MS SQL. And it wasn't any failing of MS SQL, but anyways, I won't explain the event, but we needed to get that entire database back, and they had an excellent solution in place, and they were able to get it back in about 6 hours, a database for a several thousand user system. They had Reload for Retain, but Reload for Retain doesn't back up MS SQL. Now, so make sure that you've got a backup solution in place. Again, for those of you on MySQL, you can use your own solutions. There's commercial solutions, or you can use what's built into Reload for Retain. That might very well be sufficient for you. And you might also want to consider backing up your database to the cloud. One way, one architecture, and I've implemented this with a customer in Europe, is they've got a master-slave architecture. And so it's really slick with a master-slave architecture of this is a MySQL, but you can do this in Oracle or MS SQL. Anyways, what's really neat about a master-slave architecture is as soon as data is committed to the database on the master or the production system, it's kept in a transaction log in a sense, and then that effectively gets replicated over somewhat instantly over to the slave database, which could be on-site or off-site, and you can have multiple slaves to a master, and so you can easily implement this off-site, which is very attractive. Don't ever point to the slave replica. Only do so in the case of a disaster recovery scenario with Retain. Okay, so that's just an FYI. Okay. Backing up the Retain archive data, okay, that is the real challenge in backing up Retain. Backing up a database, that's no problem. That's easy stuff. Backing up the blobs in Retain, sorry, I just need a drink of water. Backing up the archive blob files is difficult, and here's why. Those blob files are spread in and amongst 16.7 million directories, okay, potentially. And your traditional backup software, when it approaches that, iterates through all of those 16.7 million directories for two things. One, to see if there's any new blob files or any files that are there that it hasn't backed up, and then two, to see if there's any deltas to those files that they've changed. Now, it's extremely inefficient having to iterate through 16.7 million directories. Doesn't matter how fast your system is, 16.7 is just a lot. And so to go back to United Bank, they spare no expense, quite frankly, for the systems that they've got. They've got incredible systems, and but nonetheless, 16.7 million directories to iterate through just takes a long time. And so. And then the other thing is that backup software doesn't know is that blob files don't ever change, and so it's needless for them to be looking through for deltas to blob files, but nonetheless they do. And so that's the problem in trying to back up the retain archive. And so we'll talk in a moment about how Reload for Retain handles that. And then the retain index files. Now, they are important to back up. They're not, if we talk about criticality, they're not as critical as the database and the archive files, because if you lost the database or you lost the archive files, they can't be recreated. But the indexes can. Now, if you had to recreate the indexes, though, it can take months on larger systems. Okay, so obviously you wouldn't want to lose those retain indexes if you can do anything about getting those backed up. And in fact, if you wanted to actually properly challenge your backup solution, like we talked about which you can easily do with Reload for Retain, then it's crucial that you back up your indexes. Okay, so again, the challenge of backing up Reload for Retain, that people have, there's really two challenges. One, backing up the archives, and two, challenging the whole backup solution. Okay, again, backing up databases and indexes really isn't all that hard, but those blob files, how do we back it up? So here's what Reload for Retain does. Is the first backup, it uses the same old method any other backup solution would have to do. It iterates through the 16.7 million directories looking for files, and if there's a file to replicate, it has to replicate that. So sorry folks, I've got a dry palate, so I've got to just drink here. Okay, so that's the very first time. And so what it does to back up, I've got a large customer implementation in Africa actually right now, and they've been backing up for a few weeks now to get that initial backup. And then we suppose that their nightly backups will probably be an hour or two or something like that. But that initial backup takes a long time because we have to replicate everything and validate that we've replicated it and so forth. But then every other backup afterwards is what's called an integrated backup. Basically, it's an incremental backup. And the way it's able to do an incremental backup is instead of going to the disk and doing file scans, okay, like other backup software does, we go to the database and we say, okay, what new blob files are there? What new archive files are there? And we build a manifest from that, and then replicate those files from the manifest. We also know that none of the archive files have changed, so we don't have to track that in any other way than just the fact that we've actually replicated the item initially. Okay, so that's a super important feature, that integration, and there's no other software that knows how to do that. So let's talk about the backup capabilities of Reload for Retain. So this is kind of a review. The database, if you're on MySQL, it's a complete backup solution for your MySQL database system. If you've got MS SQL or Oracle, then you need to go to a commercial solution for that. The blobs, it's a hyper fast backup of the retain archive files. But what's also slick is every time a backup is run, it runs a randomized blob file test routine. So let me explain that. What it does is it goes out on the retain server and it looks through a random set of directories. Now, when I say random, you tell it to scan. You go in and you set the value and you say, hey, the default the default factory value is 1,000 different directories that it will get the listings of those directories and see what those files are specifically, and then it sends that off to the server right along with the backup job and says, hey, this is a random list of blobs that are just spread in amongst these 16.7 million directories. You confirm that you have them over there on the server, okay? Will you confirm that? And the backup server, the reload server is where it's at. And so, the server component then confirms each one of those. And if there is a failure, what it does is it flags, and this is a setting that you can twiddle if you want, but by default the flag says, okay, well then kick off a full backup. If there's even one item that fails the randomized blob test, then kick off a full backup, which goes back through again that older method of scanning through the data. Now, after you've got your initial full backup, doing another full backup another time is, in my experience, takes about 1/5 the time of the initial full backup. So if your initial full backup took, let's just say 5 days, then it'll take 1 day to get that full backup the second time around. So, and then also when those blobs are sent off, you have the randomized blobs, but you have the new blobs that are sent off based on the query from the database, and every one of those is confirmed by the server. And if the server doesn't get the blob, it effectively notifies what's called the agent. You have what's called an agent in the server. It effectively notifies the agent by not advancing what's called a timestamp. And then the agent takes a second crack at trying to replicate that data. After a second crack, nothing's going to happen. You're just going to get an email that says, hey, you know what, I tried to replicate this and I couldn't, and I'm just letting you know. And that way you can go in and dig around and try and figure out why it is that particular blob isn't replicating across. I haven't had this problem before, but nonetheless, it's built into the software to make sure that everything actually does get checked off the list and does get replicated over. Okay. And then reload for retain is completely replicates your indexes, and so that's again not really a problem in order to accomplish that. They're just in a couple different directories, and they're rather easy to back up. Okay, so let's talk about the mirroring. Again, this is a little bit of a review, but if you want to set up a mirroring solution, which again is relevant for customers that have long dredge periods, or relative for customers who are using our technology beyond a dredging mail. So for example, let's say you've got our mobile solution or other solutions that the way they're designed is they don't dredge once a day. They push stuff into retain all throughout the day. And so the notion of getting a backup once a day, well, that's not as attractive, because then if you ever had a disaster, what data have you lost? And so mirroring is very attractive in these kinds of environments. Now, also what's neat is each backup, be it mirrored or non-mirrored, can be replicated to 3 different servers. Your on-site, your off-site, and your partner cloud. And in fact, I should also say, if you want to get really crazy, it's actually really easy to replicate your data to up to 60 other reload servers. That's pretty crazy, but nonetheless, you have even more flexibility beyond what I'm showing you here in this slideshow. So, and that's what this is showing is your retain data can be replicated to multiple reload servers. So for example, at United Bank, we've got one reload server that their retain system is being replicated to, and it's in Virginia, and they just set up another reload server out in West Virginia, and we're going to start replicating to that one. Now, disaster recovery. So what's really slick is you have push-button disaster recovery, and we will demonstrate all of this. The ability to go in, push one button, and wait for a few minutes because it's got to load retain on that particular box. It just, the retain software needs to be loaded into memory. And then once it's loaded into memory, you can easily go in and challenge your backup solution. And for those of you on MySQL, what's slick is the retained database can be automatically imported if you're not using the master slave, or you could use both, quite frankly. But and then your backup is then usable. You can actually perform the tasks that you might do. Let's say you're doing like a legal query or something like that. You could do that inside of your backup, and what that does is that further proves that, hey, this is all working, and so I would encourage lots of customers to consider doing that. Okay, so let's go to a demonstration here, and I want to just show you some of the components here. First off, so you can kind of understand the architecture, we have here what's called a reload for retained server. Okay, so this is the server component, and then I want to show you the agent component. Okay, so the agent component, it runs over on the retained server, or if your retained system is on Windows, it runs on this same server that hosts reload, and it just has an NFS mount over your Windows server. So anyways, this agent, what's slick is everything that it does is replicated over to the web interface, this log and so forth, and so you can, if you're into web interfaces, you can see that. But if you want a really good real time, you can go into the text-based part of this interface, and you can see here it's doing a backup of this data. We've got what's called the mirroring agent configured, and this is mirroring data from my retained server over to my reload for retained server. So here's my GroupWise system. I'm logged in, and I generated a bunch of email back several days ago, and it's now being dredged out, and here we go, by, oh, well, it actually just completed here shortly ago. Okay, great. So it was being dredged and by the worker, and the worker then was stuffing it into the reload server, and we can see that we've got all these items here inside of the retained server. Sorry, that's where it is. And so these items then have been being replicated by the reload server with no effort of our own because of this mirroring capability. And so you're just watching what's called the event log that shows you exactly what's going on in this mirroring process. So we're going to just wait for this for just a minute. And here's what I want to do. I want to go into GroupWise. Let me log out and log right back in. I've got this user. And I'm going to create an email, and I'm going to say, okay, so test message on December 6th, okay, all right, and let's just put that in the message body. That's going to be a blob, okay, and then let's put in some other kind of a blob, and so I'll just put in a Python script here. And so we've got a subject, message, and our Python script here. Okay, so this is a blob, this is a blob, and so we're going to go ahead and send that. Now, so that's been generated inside of my email. Okay, now what I need to do is I need to go into retain, and I need to just kind of jiggle the handle here, and what this is doing is here's our worker. Okay, jiggling the handle, what I'm doing is I'm now telling retain to start a dredge. Okay, and so here we go. You can see that. Okay, it's dredging, and it's going to show here in a minute. It'll probably be all done here in a minute. Okay, it's all done. It dredged out. Total new messages archived, right? Okay, because that was a sent and a received item, and so those items now are inside of retain. So if I go here, okay, there we go. And we open up the item, okay, and there's the message body, okay. And I'm in fact going to just copy that to the clipboard, okay. Now what I also want to observe over here is, let me pull up my, sorry, here you can't see my controls. I'm going to pull that up. There we go. Okay. So now what I'm observing here is that this mirroring agent discovered, or will discover here in a moment, this new item, and it's going to mirror both the indexes and the blob. Okay, so you see this right here. It's going to replicate those. Now you might go, gee, it said over here 2 and over here it's 4, right? Well, let me explain that. Okay, and sure enough, okay, we can see, so what this proves is that we have the, you know, the blobs, the individual blobs. In fact, let me just open this up here. You can see that it just executed a Python script. I hope that wasn't like format C. Anyways, when I open that up, you see there's this Python script, and it, I think I can do a show in folder just to kind of, I'm trying to do a show in folder. There we go. So you see that Python script that I downloaded. Okay, great. So so I've got the content. Now let's do the final test. Okay, can we search for it, right? Okay, so we're going to just go here to search, right? And we're going to do pop test message on December 6th. Okay, and we're doing a search, and sure enough, the search works. So here's what we proved. Okay, is that the item's been, you know, it's in the database. Now, of course, it's in the database because we're using the same database in this particular scenario, okay? So it's in the database, but also the blob and the indexes have been fully replicated as a result of the mirroring feature, okay? So that's really slick. Now, here's the next thing I want to do is I want to go in here and I want to say, hey, user, here we go. Second test message on December 6th. Okay, all right. And I'm going to put that in here and there, and I'll just do another Python script here, pop. Okay, now we know that the mirroring agent will get that, but what I want to do, the next thing I want to do is I want to pull up and I want to kick off a backup job, and so I'm going to say, there we go, okay, and that will take it a couple minutes, but let me explain to you why I wanted to kick that off is I want to show you that I don't have to use the database from the production system. I can use a database because I'm on MySQL, okay, I can use a database that gets backed up vis-a-vis a dump, okay, and then imported over on my reload server, okay, and so that's going to be cool to see kind of full circle. Now, while we're waiting for that to go on, because that'll take a couple minutes, okay, in fact, let's just observe this here, and, oh, okay, now let me show you, okay, the software's saying, hey, look, I can't get a hold of this server, and the reason is because it's in disaster recovery mode. So let's turn off disaster recovery mode. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to kick off that backup again. That's working as designed, just, you know. Let's just stop that job so that it, okay, and we'll wait a minute for that to go on. But yeah, so that's an intelligent piece of the software. It says, hey, that other guy's in disaster recovery mode. I'm not going to be replicating indexes and whatever it be, you know, while that guy is using the data, right, over on that side. And so disaster recovery basically effectively tells the agent, don't you try and replicate data. And, you know, when you think of your typical disaster recovery scenario, you're production server, your production retain server, which is where we're running this agent, would be down anyways, and so you wouldn't even have these options to do that. So, okay, I'm going to go into job, and I'm going to start the job, the default job, okay? Now, while we're waiting for that to go on, I want to talk about some key parts of, some key features in Reload for Retain that are really important. What I found is when you go to do that initial backup of your Retain system, it can take quite a while. And the concern for people is you can configure what's called threads in Reload for Retain. And you can go in and let's say you say, okay, I'm going to use one thread. And you run it for a couple days and so forth, and you're like, okay, we've only gotten like 5% through the data. How about if I increase threads? So you go in, you look at your server, you're like, you know what, I can increase threads. You can go in and you can throw another thread in from the interface and say, add a thread. And it will immediately add that thread to the job, and thus you're getting your data hopefully twice as fast. Another thing is you can go in and you can say, hey, look, Reload for Retain, you're getting this data during the dredge period or maybe during business hours, these particular business hours. I don't want you to run that initial backup, and so you can tell it to pause the job and then resume after hours. And again, these are things you really are going to use only one time, that initial time that you do your backup, but you'll be very, very appreciative for that functionality. Okay, so now a backup is going on, and we can witness that here in our event log. And so we're just waiting for that to all come through so I can demonstrate the push button disaster recovery for you. Let me just look back at my notes and see what else I can demonstrate for you. Yeah, there's really not a whole lot more. I think we've explained everything from the slideshow. Let me come back over here and see if there's any other finer points. I apologize, I kind of got this out of kilter. Okay, so yeah, we're just waiting for this this backup to happen. Let me just show you in this real-time log that what it's doing. And now in this customer environment or in this environment, I've got my MySQL database dump going on. It's being replicated to two locations, okay? This particular backup set is being replicated to 2 locations. So I'm replicating it to this reload server, and I'm replicating it to that reload server. So we're acting like this is an on-site and this is an off-site reload server. And this can, for example, be a reload server out in Guava's cloud or one of your partners. If you're in Europe, there's a lot of partners out there, and they may be willing to host a reload for retain server at their location. Okay. And so yeah, this backup is being replicated. And so if I go to this server, for example, and I look at this event log, okay, we can see this is my second reload server. Here's my first one, here's my second one, and you notice here we call it the offsite reload server, okay? And I'm just looking to see, okay, here we go. We can see it's 12:42. We see here just a moment ago that it says, okay, I got that backup, and I think it does the automatic import of the MySQL database. I need to go and see if it does auto reload MySQL database. Yes, so it's actually should be importing that MySQL database, and then it will write to this log that it's finished importing it, and that could take a little while, so we may not be able to demonstrate that. But after it's imported the database, you can then go into disaster recovery. You can say localhost, okay, use that database, and so I'll demonstrate that over on this server here for a minute. I'm going to go here. Let me look at the event log, see where it is in. Okay. I'm going to go in here and say use the local database. Now it might not be the one, it might be the one, you know, from a while back, because it could still be importing. So what I'm going to do is I'll just use this database. I'm going to click on Enable Disaster Recovery. I think you can see how simple this is to use disaster recovery. It's just, you know, you set everything up and you push the button. Now I will admit, getting Retain installed on a new server, you know, is a project, and so it's not like you just install the software and everything's going to, you know, work right out of the box. You got to install Retain over on the server that's hosting Reload, and you know, let's say you've got MySQL, for example, you've got to make sure that you've got the same version of MySQL and so forth. So you know, we love to work with customers on this. We want them to be successful with this software. So when you go to actually implement it, we're happy to help you to get Retain onto the Reload server. The Reload components are rather simple to install. Getting Retain onto a new server and making sure that everything kind of matches up and mirrors up is a little bit of a project, but we're happy to help you on that. And so we're just waiting for this to come up, and then we can log in and just kind of, okay, oh, okay, perfect. So you can see this over here. You see this right here? Right here it says it extracted the MySQL database, and now it's importing that over on this particular server. This is my offsite server, okay? And if it doesn't take very long, it's still importing it, we can go in and we will see that everything that we see here, the exact same experience that we have over here, okay, we will have over on this other server, okay? This server, sorry, that's doing in the import of the database, all right? So that's what we seek to do, is to have that entire experience fully replicated after this import has gone on. If we were to actually look at this server, we would just see the MySQL daemon kind of sitting there going crazy. Oh yeah, let's talk about another way to implement that is really cool. Okay, and this is something that I've talked about, the notion of mirroring. Okay, so I've got a customer that we've already set the MySQL dump up and the import, but for this particular customer, it was taking 80 hours to do the import. So we don't really like that idea. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in a master slave, and I've done that with yet a different customer, and so I know that works, and that works great. But then what we're also going to do is we're going to have two databases. One's going to be called Retain, and one's going to be called Retain Import. Okay, so the import, the Retain Import database is the one that we will be importing the MySQL dumps into, and that'll take a few days for it to import into, but okay, no problem. And then the other will be the master slave, and so if ever we had a disaster scenario, we could just point to the slave instance of the database on localhost and use that instance of the database. But let's say the worst case scenario, let's say that the database got corrupted. And of course with master slave, you know, if it gets corrupted on the master, it's likely going to get corrupted over on the slave. And so so what's slick is we're going to have the Retain Import. That's going to be our failover mechanism. We can fail over to that one if there happens to be corruption in a master slave. Now, you know, I don't generally run into that in databases, but you know, there's that potentiality, and so we're now going to design the system to work with both potential situations, and it's perfectly feasible to have two completely separate copies of the retain database, one being called retain, one being called retain import. If you think about the databases, it's really just another bucket. So you've taken all the data from the one retain database and you've put it into another bucket called retain import. And so the name of the database does not have to be the same. It's just the content has to be the same. Okay, we're going to come back here and see if it's finished. Okay, nope, it's still importing. So we may not see this all come out, but you're going to just have to believe me that it's really slick and it works well. If I'd done this at the very beginning, that probably would have given us enough time to do the import. The import of the MySQL database, well, I'll tell you, for example, in this customer environment where it was taking 80 hours to import, the export, the dump, was taking about 2 hours. And so it's at least based on this customer's environment, it's a ratio of 40 times to import versus to export. Now, I had a much smaller environment, and their import goes on within a couple hours, and so for them this is perfectly feasible, and they don't have to go to a master slave. And you don't have to tell Reload for Retain to import the MySQL database. You can just have it store those MySQL databases for however long you've indicated that you want backups to be kept. And so here we indicate the number of backups to keep, and so right now in this particular scenario we're keeping about 2 weeks worth of backups hot and live over on the Reload server. Well, I shouldn't say hot and live. That database is just a copy of the database inside of a file, and that has, if you go to an older instance of the database, it has to be imported in manually in some manner. If you ever needed assistance with that, call us. We can help you. It's not a big deal. So another thing, and now we're getting into some really crazy stuff, but I'm just going to tell you about another really cool feature that you could do. And this is this notion of starting a local reload for retain agent job. So let me tell you about the potentiality of something like this. I haven't had anybody do this yet, but let's say you do the MySQL dump and you send it off-site, and then you want that to daisy chain to yet another reload instance. And so all you would do is you'd go in and you would have the MySQL dump sent over to the offsite location, and then that offsite location would import the MySQL database, and then the agent, the reload for retain agent piece, would query that database and say what new blobs are there. It would replicate those blobs and could send the MySQL database to yet another location. So you can literally daisy chain so that the offsite location doesn't need access to the database that's on site. It can be accessing the database that's been imported into MySQL at the offsite location. So pretty crazy stuff. I haven't implemented it with anybody as of yet, so it's slightly theoretical, but perfectly feasible. A very, very powerful feature. Okay, let's just see if we happen to be lucky enough for that. Nope, it's still importing. So, well, I think I've talked about how this works. Let's go a little bit into how you set it up. What you do to implement reload for retain is, of course, you've got your retain system. You implement what's called the server, and so that's a SUSE Linux box, okay? And on that SUSE Linux box, you install retain, okay? Now, even if you've got retain on Windows, no problem, okay? You put it on your SUSE Linux box, and you install retain, and you just install the software, okay? And then you make sure your Tomcat is mirroring the Tomcat instance that's over on your retain system that's on Linux, if you're using Linux, and if you're using Windows, there's a different approach to it. I don't want to get too much into the weeds. And anyway, so you implement those pieces, and you get your backup, okay? And then you go inside of reload, and you just simply go in, sorry, to, here we go. You go inside of here, and you fill in some very simple settings as to how to access. Now, if you were using an MS SQL, it would say MS SQL database access, or using Oracle, it'd be the same. You tell it how to access the database that you want. So, for example, my customer that just yesterday we were working with a customer on MS SQL, we put in the IP address, not of localhost, but we put in the IP address for their MS SQL server. Okay, so you fill that in, and what that does is that modifies the AS config on the local retain instance of the software that's installed on the server to reflect these various values. Okay, and then retain is able to, bam, get into that data. Okay, and so you implement the server, you implement the agent, you back up the data, and then you go in and you can test disaster recovery, and it's really rather simple to set it up, but the documentation is also very helpful. We have what's called inline documentation, so if you want to understand what these features are, you can use the inline documentation, and we have excellent documentation here that just breaks out exactly how you implement reload for retain. It just takes you step by step. So that is a general overview of reload for retain. If there's any questions, Q, I'll take those. I'm going to do one last check and see if that import happened to have finished. Nope, it hasn't, and so I can't show you, but you'll just have to take my word for it that it imports that, and we would have an exact duplicate of our retain system over here. The databases are completely independent of one another, so that's if that doesn't make you feel secure, I don't know what will. So it's a excellent feature. So any questions that we have from the audience, Q?
Yeah, let's see. There was one that came through. It said, what is the disk requirement for reload versus retain?
Oh, great question. I should have brought that up. So pretty much the size of your retain server. Now, it's not entirely true. If you're on if your database is MS SQL or Oracle, just say 101% of the size of your retain server. So if your retain server, let's say your retain server is 100 gigabytes, you'll want 101 gigabytes over on the reload server. Okay. If you're on the MySQL platform and you want to do those MySQL dumps, and I don't know why you wouldn't, then you've got to allocate a little bit more disk space for those MySQL dumps. Now, what's really nice is the MySQL dumps are put into a GZ file, and so they're compressed, and so they're quite a bit smaller. But if you do this auto import feature, then it decompresses it, and then it imports that database in. So take that into account. So a customer on MySQL, let's just say, just to be safe, probably about 110% of the size of your of your retain server, your production retain server, is what you'll want to allocate on the reload server. So and also allocate for growth, just as you've done on your retain server. So make sure that you don't allocate based on the current disk usage, but what your disk usage is on your retain server. Sorry, your disk size on your retain server. And I would even try and mirror, if you possibly can. You don't have to, but you may want to consider, kind of sometimes people will put like their database maybe on a faster disk than their blobs or something like that. You may want to mirror that, because when you think about it, if you have a disaster, you probably want it to perform at least, somewhat like the other system. Not entirely necessary, and in fact, quite frankly, that's a luxury. So I'm not saying it's something you need to do, but it's something to consider. So excellent question. Thank you, Q.
And let's see. I don't see any other. Oh, let's see. No, there's some more here. Another one came through. Okay, so it says, if we back up to tape, does it make sense to back up reload to tape and not back up retain at all? Currently, we back up the VM of retain to tape, but would like to get rid of that and just backup reload?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. That's an excellent approach to backing up the data. I would, if you were to ask me, I'd recommend that. Put less strain on your production retain system. When you think about it, your production retain system, more and more is going to play a bigger role in your organization. I'm seeing more and more customers that are using retain for customer-facing experiences. We've even got a mobile app for retain. And so why sit there and tickle and torment your system even more from a tape standpoint when you can get the data vis-a-vis the reload server? So yeah, that's an excellent recommendation and endpoint. And I know we're at the very end, but this is really exciting here. Look at this. It imported the MySQL database, okay, on the reload server, and there's a feature called auto reload. So in theory, let me just see if this works. Aha. So here's what's really cool. Let me just show you this here. There's a feature inside of reload that says, but it's only available if you're using MySQL, okay, because it says, oh, hey, you know what? If you've got a wholly separate retain server that's got your MySQL database that you've imported in and so forth, then, why don't we just allow you to auto reload the local retain server? And so that's what it's done. I didn't even have to turn on disaster recovery, okay? And it's using, let me just double check here on this, general settings, local retain server. It's using localhost, okay? So it's using the database that was imported, and it just finished this import, okay? So the database, the MySQL database, is now wholly contained on this reload server. I'm trying to make this as clear as I can. And so now I'm going to log into it, and here's what I expect to see. Oh, let's see, let's type in the right password. Let's try again. Okay, here we go. And so when I go to search messages, okay, I'm going to go to browse first, okay, mailbox. Okay, aha, test message on December 6th. You see that? Okay. Now if I log in, if I look at my primary retain system, there we go, test message on December 6th, okay? So it's an exact duplicate. Let's come over here. And I'm going to open it up, and there we go. And I'm going to search for it, okay? And bink. And that takes a moment. Oh, I got to click on that. And there we go. There's the message. Searchable, fully contained, over on the reload server. Bada bing, it's magic. You've got an entire backup solution. Instead of just cold data, okay, that you hope works, you have a backup that you can challenge of your retained data. And I think that, not to belabor that point, but I think people see more and more retain as very, very important in your organization. You need to have a good, challengeable backup solution for retain, and that's what's reload for retain. So unless there's any other questions, I think we're ready to wrap it up.
Doesn't look like we have any other questions. Thanks, Tay, for the information and great presentation, great information, and I can just say this is really cool. I just have to mention that, Tay. Great stuff and great demonstration, and I hope everyone on this call can see how cool this is.
Great. Thank you, Q.
So yes, and as I stated before, this has been recorded, so look for that recording, and we'll get that out to you soon. Thanks everyone once again for being here and for your interest in this webinar.